The rain came down in sheets, flooding everything in sight. I pulled my old sedan to the shoulder of the muddy road, wiping condensation from the windshield as I squinted through the downpour. Another failed job interview. Another day closer to complete financial ruin. The weight of responsibility pressed down on my shoulders heavier than the storm clouds above. 2 children depending on me, and I was failing them spectacularly. I had been an engineer at Westlake Technologies for 11 years before the corporate restructuring that left me and 37 others without jobs, without severance, and without warning. 6 months of unemployment had drained my savings, strained my relationships, and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about security and stability. The divorce 2 years prior had been difficult enough. This felt like the universe twisting the knife. Through the curtain of rain, I noticed frantic movement in the field adjacent to the road. Squinting harder, I made out the figure of an older woman in rubber boots and a weather-beaten coat, desperately piling sandbags around what appeared to be a modest farmhouse. Water was rapidly rising around the structure, threatening to breach her makeshift barriers. The small barn behind the house already had water pushing against its doors. I should have driven on. I had my own problems, mountains of them. My ex-wife was threatening to reduce my visitation rights if I missed another child support payment. My landlord had already given me an extension I could not afford to pay back. My children needed school supplies I could barely provide. But something made me pull over completely, turn off the engine, and step out into the deluge. "Need some help?" I called out, sloshing through ankle-deep water toward the woman. She looked up, pushing a strand of gray hair from her face. Her expression shifted from surprise to cautious relief. "Unless you can command the rain to stop, I am not sure anyone can help much," she said with a wry smile that belied the severity of her situation. "I cannot control the weather," I responded, already rolling up my sleeves. "But I am an engineer, or was anyway. I might be able to help with water diversion." For the next 3 hours, we worked side by side in silence punctuated only by my occasional suggestions about water flow patterns and her quiet acknowledgments. I discovered her name was Margaret when she finally introduced herself during a brief moment when the rain subsided to a drizzle. She did not ask my name immediately, which struck me as odd, but I was too exhausted to dwell on social niceties. We managed to divert the worst of the flooding away from the house, though the fields were completely submerged. As darkness fell, I found myself accepting her offer of hot coffee on her covered porch, my clothes soaked through, my job search temporarily forgotten. "Thank you," she said simply, studying me over the rim of her mug. Not many would have stopped. I shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude I did not feel I deserved. "I know what it is like to watch everything you have worked for threatened. No one should face that alone." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "You mentioned you were an engineer." "Hydraulic systems design, primarily," I explained, surprised at how easily I spoke to this stranger. "Specialized in water management infrastructure for agricultural applications before shifting to industrial systems. Not that it matters much now." "It mattered today," she said quietly. I drove home that evening to my sparsely furnished rental, to the stack of past due notices on my kitchen table, to the silence that reminded me my children would not be with me until the weekend. But something had shifted, however, slightly. For the first time in months, I had felt useful, necessary, like my knowledge and skills actually mattered in the real world, not just on a resume that kept being passed over. The next morning, I found myself driving back to Margaret's farm. I told myself it was to check if the water had receded, if her property had sustained serious damage. In truth, I needed to feel useful again, even if just for a few more hours. Margaret seemed unsurprised to see me. She stood in her muddy yard, surveying the aftermath with hands on her hips. The water had indeed receded somewhat, but had left destruction in its wake. Fencing had been washed away, the small vegetable garden was ruined, and debris was scattered across her property. "I thought you might return," she said by way of greeting. "The coffee is already on." Over the next several days, I fell into a routine. Mornings were spent sending out resumes and attending increasingly desperate interviews. Afternoons, I helped Margaret restore her small farm. She grew organic vegetables and kept a modest number of animals, chickens, 2 goats, and an ancient horse that seemed to exist primarily to eat apples from her hand. The work was physical and demanding, but it gave structure to days that had become formless with unemployment. During these afternoons, I found myself sharing more than I intended about my situation. The bitter divorce that had left me emotionally drained, the corporate downsizing that had crushed my financial stability, my deep fear of failing my children. Margaret listened without judgment, offering the occasional insight that revealed surprising wisdom. "The measure of our character is not found in our successes," she told me one afternoon as we repaired a chicken coop, "but in how we respond to our failures. Your children will remember your persistence more than your prosperity." When my custody weekend arrived, I hesitated to mention my volunteer work at Margaret's farm. But with limited funds for entertainment, I cautiously brought my 10-year-old son and 8-year-old daughter to help feed the animals. Margaret welcomed them with a warmth that surprised me, showing a patient gentleness I had not expected. By the end of the day, my children were begging to return, enchanted by the freedom of the farm and Margaret's willingness to let them explore and learn. "You have remarkable children," Margaret observed as we watched them chase fireflies at dusk. "They have your analytical mind, but tempered with curiosity." "They are the only thing I have done right," I admitted. Margaret studied me for a long moment. "I have been considering hearing help to restore the property properly," she said finally. "The flood damage is beyond what I can manage alone. Would you be interested in temporary work? I cannot offer much, but the hours would be flexible enough to allow for your continued job search and custody schedule." The offer felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. I accepted immediately, attempting to maintain some dignity by negotiating reasonable terms rather than revealing how desperately I needed any income at all. "I will see you tomorrow then," Margaret said with a smile that, had I been paying closer attention, might have seemed cryptic. The work at Margaret's farm was physically demanding but deeply satisfying. We rebuilt fences, restored gardens, and cleared debris. Margaret worked alongside me each day, her stamina belying her age, which I guessed to be somewhere in her 60s. We shared simple lunches on her porch and conversations that meandered through topics from sustainable agriculture to global economics. I began to notice inconsistencies in her persona. Her knowledge of international markets seemed incongruous with her seemingly modest means, her occasional references to travels in Asia and Europe at odds with her simple farmer appearance. One afternoon, a sleek black SUV pulled into her driveway. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, nodded curtly to me, and spoke with Margaret in hushed tones for nearly 20 minutes before departing. When I raised an eyebrow, Margaret simply explained him away as an old friend checking in after the flood. I did not press, though my curiosity was piqued. Similar incidents accumulated. Deliveries arrived containing equipment far more sophisticated than necessary for a small organic farm. Once, I overheard Margaret on the phone discussing turbine efficiency ratings with a level of technical specificity that rivaled my former colleagues. When I mentioned possibly applying for an engineering position at a factory in the next county, Margaret asked probing questions about my specific expertise that revealed surprising technical knowledge. The most puzzling discovery came when I was repairing irrigation lines damaged in the flood. Tracing a water line to its source, I uncovered a sophisticated water management system hidden beneath a seemingly ordinary garden shed. Technology I recognized as cutting-edge and prohibitively expensive for small agricultural operations. When questioned, Margaret smiled enigmatically and murmured something about making good investments when opportunities arise. I might have investigated these anomalies further had my personal situation not deteriorated dramatically. My ex-wife, frustrated with my reduced child support payments, delivered a formal legal notice threatening court action to reduce my visitation rights. The timing could not have been worse. I had just received another rejection from a promising job prospect. That evening, sitting on Margaret's porch after a day of clearing flood debris, I confessed the depths of my financial despair. "I am going to lose them," I admitted, staring into my coffee cup. "My children, everything I have done, all my efforts to stay present in their lives, none of it will matter if I cannot meet these payments." Margaret listened silently, her expression unreadable in the fading light. The next morning, as we worked on rebuilding a garden wall, she mentioned casually, "I heard about an engineering position available at a local agricultural business. They need someone with your specific background in water management systems. I would be happy to recommend you." I thanked her, though privately I doubted any local agricultural operation would require my specialized skills. Still, I agreed to interview, not wanting to disappoint Margaret after her kindness. She gave me an address and suggested a time later that week, offering to put in a good word with the management. When the interview day arrived, I drove 30 minutes to an address I had never visited before, located on a winding road several miles from Margaret's farm. As the trees cleared, I was astonished to find myself approaching an impressive glass and steel building complex I had never known existed in our rural county. The sign at the entrance read, "Harrington Agricultural Innovations," a name that triggered vague recognition from industry publications, but that I had always assumed was headquartered in some distant city. The receptionist greeted me by name before I could introduce myself, which I found odd but attributed to Margaret's recommendation. Instead of directing me to a human resources department or interview room, she led me to an executive elevator and up to a top-floor suite with breathtaking views of thousands of acres of farmland, advanced greenhouse structures, and what appeared to be a research facility. "Ms. Harrington will be with you shortly," the receptionist said, leaving me alone in the luxurious office. My confusion mounted as I waited, examining framed photographs on the wall showing agricultural innovations and global development projects. Several industry awards displayed names that made my heart rate increase with recognition, patents for irrigation systems I had studied and admired during my career. The door opened, and I turned, expecting to meet some corporate executive named Harrington. Instead, Margaret entered, but not the Margaret I knew. Gone were the work clothes and mud-stained boots. This Margaret wore an impeccably tailored business suit, her silver hair arranged in a sophisticated style, her bearing unmistakably that of someone accustomed to authority. "I suppose I owe you an explanation," she said, gesturing for me to sit. My shock must have been evident as she explained the truth. She was Margaret Harrington, founder and CEO of Harrington Agricultural Innovations, one of the largest and most innovative sustainable farming corporations in the country. The small farm where we had met was merely her private residence and experimental garden on the edge of her vast commercial agricultural empire. "Your resume crossed my desk about a month ago," she explained. "Human Resources had overlooked it, but I recognized your name from a paper you published on adaptive irrigation systems for climate-challenged regions. I had flagged it for follow-up when the flood hit. When you stopped to help me, not knowing who I was, expecting nothing in return, I saw an opportunity to evaluate not just your technical skills, but your character." I sat in stunned silence as she continued. "Your engineering solutions during the flood were innovative. Your work ethic while helping restore the farm was exemplary. But most importantly, your integrity, continuing to help someone you believed was a struggling farmer even while facing your own crisis. That cannot be assessed in any conventional interview." Margaret, Ms. Harrington, slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a job offer for a senior engineering position developing next-generation irrigation systems for climate-challenged regions. The salary was nearly double what I had earned at Westlake. The benefits included flexible hours to accommodate my custody schedule and immediate start date. "The position is yours if you want it," she said simply, "though I understand if you feel manipulated or deceived by my methods." I stared at the document, emotions warring within me. Relief at the financial lifeline collided with confusion and a sense of betrayal. The woman I had come to respect and even confide in had been living a double life. Or rather, I had been interacting with only a carefully curated fraction of who she truly was. "I need time to process this," I said finally. Margaret nodded. "Take the weekend, the offer remains open." I accepted the position, of course. The alternative was financial ruin and potentially losing access to my children. But the transition was far from smooth. My first weeks at Harrington Agricultural Innovations were a whirlwind of adjustments, not just to new responsibilities and colleagues, but to reconciling the humble farmer I had befriended with the powerful CEO she truly was. In the office, Margaret maintained professional distance, treating me with the same courteous efficiency she showed all employees. This corporate persona bore little resemblance to the woman who had shared coffee on her porch and listened to my personal struggles. I found myself missing our easy conversations even as I immersed myself in challenging work that rekindled my passion for engineering. My colleagues regarded me with curiosity and some suspicion. Rumors circulated about how an unemployed engineer had secured a senior position without progressing through the usual channels. Some suggested I had manipulated the eccentric founder. Others implied more unseemly connections. I focused on proving my worth through my work, but the social isolation was difficult after the genuine connection I had felt during those days working at the farm. Meanwhile, my improved financial situation allowed me to move my children to better housing and enroll them in activities I had previously been unable to afford. My ex-wife, noticing these changes, became suspicious, accusing me of having hidden assets during our divorce proceedings and threatening further legal action. The children, unaware of the complexity, kept asking when they could return to Farmer Margaret's place, not knowing her true identity or my complicated feelings about her deception. The most challenging aspect emerged when I began reviewing the company's flagship irrigation systems as part of my new role. With my specialized knowledge and recent experience with actual flood conditions, I identified potential vulnerabilities in the current designs, issues that could, under specific circumstances similar to our recent flooding, cause contamination in surrounding watersheds. This discovery put me in an impossible position. Bringing attention to design flaws in the company's primary technology could jeopardize my newly secured position. Remaining silent could potentially allow environmental damage and massive liability, not to mention betraying my own professional integrity. The situation was further complicated when I learned through office conversations that a rival agricultural corporation was actively seeking vulnerabilities in Harrington's systems as part of a hostile takeover attempt. For several nights, I worked late in my office, running simulations and analyzing data to confirm my suspicions before raising alarms. The patterns were clear. Under prolonged flooding conditions with specific soil compositions common in our region, the current irrigation systems could indeed leach contaminants into natural watersheds. Rather than going through official channels, I decided to approach Margaret directly, not at the corporate headquarters but at her farm, where I had first known her. I found her in the garden at dusk, kneeling in soil despite her expensive clothing, testing moisture levels with the practiced hands of someone who had worked the earth for decades. The corporate office has a perfectly functional soil testing lab, I observed as I approached. She looked up smiling. Some things I prefer to feel with my own hands. I did not return her smile. We need to talk about the Series 7 irrigation systems. Her expression shifted, the warmth receding as CEO Margaret emerged. For 2 hours, we sat at the same table where we had once shared coffee and conversations, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. I presented my analysis, showing how under specific flood conditions, the systems could fail catastrophically. Margaret's initial reaction was defensive, questioning my methodology and assumptions. When I persisted, she asked pointedly whether I had discussed my concerns with anyone else, particularly anyone from Agrex Corporation, Harrington's main competitor. "Are you questioning my loyalty?" I asked, hurt despite myself. "After everything." "I am questioning your judgment," she countered. "These systems have undergone extensive testing to suggest they are fundamentally flawed based on your limited exposure." "My limited exposure includes watching actual flood conditions affect actual land," I interrupted. "Something your controlled laboratory tests might have missed." Our conversation grew increasingly tense. The easy rapport we had developed during those days working side by side seemed to have evaporated entirely. When I finally left, nothing had been resolved. I drove home feeling as though I had lost something precious, not just a potential mentor, but a friendship I had valued more than I realized. The following morning brought more rain. By noon, weather alerts warned of potential flooding throughout the county. My phone rang as I was reviewing evacuation procedures with my children's school. It was Margaret. "I need you at test site C immediately," she said without preamble. "Bring your emergency designs." When I arrived at the test site, a 50-acre plot where Harrington tested irrigation prototypes, I was surprised to find not just Margaret but her entire executive team and representatives from the Regional Environmental Protection Agency. Margaret approached my car as I parked, rain plastering her hair to her forehead, her corporate polish washed away by the urgent reality of the situation. "You were right," she said simply. "The systems are failing exactly as you predicted. We need your modifications implemented immediately." For the next 18 hours, we worked through rain and darkness to implement emergency modifications to the irrigation systems. Margaret worked alongside engineers and field technicians, her expensive suit exchanged for coveralls, her CEO authority expressed not through commands, but through tireless effort. As dawn broke, revealing skis finally clearing, we confirmed that the modified systems had successfully prevented contamination of the adjacent watershed. In the quiet aftermath, Margaret found me drinking coffee from a thermos, exhausted but relieved. "The rival corporation knew," she said quietly, joining me. "Agrex had identified the design flaw months ago and was waiting for a catastrophic failure that would devalue our stock before their takeover bid. Your intervention saved not just the watershed but the company itself." I absorbed this information silently, too tired for recriminations or vindication. "I owe you an apology," Margaret continued. "Not just for doubting your analysis, but for the way I have maintained separation between my worlds. The truth is, I have struggled to reconcile them myself for many years." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time saw neither the humble farmer nor the powerful CEO, but simply a woman trying to navigate the complexities of identity and purpose, much as I had been doing since my life unraveled. "Why maintain the farm persona at all?" I asked. "Why not simply be Margaret Harrington, CEO?" She smiled faintly. "Because Margaret Harrington, CEO, meets people who want things from her: funding, connections, power. Margaret the farmer meets people as they truly are, without agenda or artifice. Which do you think provides more honest human connection?" I could not argue with her logic, though the deception still stung. In the aftermath of the crisis, my role at Harrington Agricultural Innovations evolved rapidly. Margaret promoted me to Chief Innovation Officer with responsibility for reviewing all designs for environmental safety and sustainability. The successful emergency modifications to the irrigation systems became the foundation for a new product line that emphasized environmental safeguards alongside agricultural efficiency. My relationship with Margaret gradually found new equilibrium. Sometimes we met in corporate boardrooms surrounded by executives and stakeholders. Other times we worked side by side at her farm, testing new ideas in the field. Both contexts now felt equally authentic, now that I understood the full spectrum of who she was. I brought my children to the farm regularly, where Margaret continued teaching them about sustainable agriculture while I developed new systems in a workshop she provided on the property. My son developed a particular interest in engineering, often spending hours beside me as I designed irrigation improvements. My daughter, always more people-oriented than her brother, formed a bond with Margaret that sometimes made me wonder if she saw in her the grandmother figure absent, since my ex-wife's mother had moved overseas. When my ex-wife learned of my new position through a local newspaper article highlighting Harrington's innovative response to environmental challenges, she predictably attempted to renegotiate our divorce settlement. Margaret connected me with the company's legal team, who helped ensure my improved circumstances benefited my children while protecting me from opportunistic claims. The bitter custody battles subsided as my financial stability removed the primary leverage my ex-wife had wielded against me. 6 months after the flood that had brought us together, Margaret hosted a company celebration at her farm, now openly acknowledged to employees as the birthplace of many of the company's most important innovations. During the event, She shared publicly the story of how a stranger had stopped to help an old farmer during a flood, never seeking advantage, but simply offering kindness. She announced the creation of the Harrington Community Resilience Initiative, which would provide engineering support to small farms affected by climate change, with me as its director. True resilience, she told the gathered employees, is found not in the strength of our structures, but in the connections between people. One person stopping to help another. That simple act contains more power to change our world than any technology we might develop. The program would hire engineers who, like me, had been displaced from traditional industries, but brought valuable skills to agricultural challenges. Already, we had identified several candidates, men and women with technical backgrounds who had been sidelined by economic shifts or personal circumstances, but retained the problem-solving abilities and work ethic needed to help small farms adapt to changing climate realities. As the celebration wound down, I found myself standing with my children and Margaret on the hill overlooking both her modest farmhouse and the vast Harrington agricultural complex beyond. The contrast was striking, the personal and the professional, the simple and the sophisticated, existing in harmony rather than opposition. My daughter, perceptive as always, asked the question that had occasionally troubled me during introspective moments. "Dad, would you have stopped to help if you had known Margaret owned everything we can see from here?" I considered the question honestly. In my darkest moment, when I felt most desperate and defeated, perhaps not. I might have been too intimidated or too resentful of such wealth and privilege. I might have assumed someone like that did not need my help. Margaret smiled, resting her hand briefly on my daughter's shoulder. "And that," she said quietly, "is precisely why I never judge people by how they treat me as a CEO, but by how they treat me as a farmer." 1 year after our first meeting in the pouring rain, I had fully settled into my role at Harrington Agricultural Innovations. The innovations we developed had strengthened the company's position as an industry leader in sustainable farming technologies. My children were thriving in their new schools, developing confidence and interests that their previously unstable home life had inhibited. I had purchased a modest but comfortable home near Margaret's farm, close enough that my son could ride his bike to the workshop, where he increasingly spent weekend hours learning engineering principles through practical application. The Harrington Community Resilience Initiative had already helped dozens of small farms implement climate-adaptive technologies, creating a growing network of sustainable agriculture across the region. Former engineers, architects, and technical specialists who had faced career disruptions similar to mine now found purpose in adapting their skills to agricultural challenges, forming a community of second-chance professionals whose diverse backgrounds brought fresh perspectives to long-standing problems. On the anniversary of the flood, Margaret invited my children and me to dinner at her farmhouse. We arrived expecting a quiet evening of reflection, but instead found the yard filled with the families of small farmers who had benefited from our program. Tables laden with food stretched across the space where I had once piled sandbags against rising waters. Children played where I had once despaired of providing for my own. After the meal, Margaret stood to address the gathering. Her speech began with expected acknowledgments of the program's success and gratitude to those who had implemented it. But then she shared something I had never known, something that recontextualized our entire relationship. Margaret revealed that she herself had once been a struggling single parent who lost everything in a flood decades earlier. An engineer had stopped to help her, eventually mentoring her and investing in her first agricultural patent. That partnership had grown into Harrington Innovations, but her benefactor had died before seeing its full success. The modest farmhouse where she still lived had been their original testing ground, preserved as a reminder of humble beginnings. When I recognized the potential in our guest of honor during another flood exactly 1 year ago, she said, nodding toward me, I was not only evaluating a potential employee, I was repaying a debt across generations. As conversation and celebration continued around us, Margaret confided her intention to gradually transition company leadership to those who understood both corporate innovation and the challenges faced by small farmers, with me among those being groomed for executive leadership. The suggestion both honored and terrified me, but I found myself more open to possibility than I would have been a year earlier. As the evening wound down, my thoughts turned to the strange alchemy that had transformed disaster into opportunity. In stopping to help what appeared to be a struggling farmer, I had not only changed my professional trajectory, but healed something in myself. The work I now did connected my technical skills to the land and community around me in ways my corporate engineering career never had, creating purpose beyond mere employment or even parenting. My daughter, never one to leave a question unasked, approached Margaret as guests began departing. "Did you deliberately flood your own farm to test my dad?" she inquired with the direct simplicity of childhood. Margaret laughed, a genuine sound that bridged all her identities. "Even I cannot control the weather," she said, eyes twinkling. "But I have learned that storms, both literal and metaphorical, often reveal people's true character and capabilities when all pretense is washed away." As we walked home that evening along the path now connecting our property to Margaret's farm, my children raced ahead, already planning improvements to the irrigation system for Margaret's experimental garden. I watched them go, struck by how completely our lives had transformed in a single year. The boundaries that once seemed so rigid, between success and failure, between CEO and farmer, between mentor and friend, between past trauma and future possibility, had dissolved into something more fluid and harmonious. In helping Margaret protect her farm from flood waters, I had been swept into a new life I could never have imagined from the desperate vantage point of that rainy day. All because I had pulled my car to the side of the road and asked a simple question: "Need some help?"